Here you may build a common town for all, and from blank name Ekesta call. The reasons, with his friend's experience joined, encouraged much, but more disturbed his mind. 'Twas dead of night, when to his slumbering eyes his father's shade descended from the skies, and thus he spoke. O more than vital breath, loved while I lived, and dear even after death, O son, in various toils and troubles tossed, the King of Heaven employs my careful ghost on his commands, the God who saved from fire your flaming feet and heard your just desire. The wholesome counsel of your friend receive, and here the coward train and women leave. The chosen youth and those who nobly dare transport to tempt the dangers of the war. The stern Italians will their courage try, rough are their manners and their minds are high. But first to Pluto's palace you shall go and seek my shade among the blessed below. For not with impious ghosts my soul remains, nor suffers with the damned perpetual pains, but breathes the living air of the soft Elysian plains. The chaste Sibylla shall your steps convey, and blood of offered victims free the way. There shall you know what realms the gods assign, and learn the fates and fortunes of your line. But now farewell, I vanish with the night, and feel the blast of heaven's approaching light. He said, and mixed with shades, and took his airy flight. Whither so fast? The filial duty cried, ah why, the wished embrace denied? He said and rose as holy zeal inspires, he rakes hot embers and renews the fires. His country, gods, and Vesta then adores, with cakes and incense, and their aid implores. They are blank, or determinations by definite law of the matter, of the iron or the wax. Heuripides, eminent as writer and teacher of rhetoric in Rome and at Athens, was drawn into blank life through imperial favor. His great wealth inherited from his father enabled him, however, to free himself from the trammels of office and to establish himself in luxury in his Attic country, devoting himself to his real ambition as an orator, and incidentally from time to time winning for himself public esteem or graceless criticism as the munificent donor of splendid structures at various sites. The blank of every human being is dependent on work and effort. The wretch, concentred all on self, vainly aspires to happiness. God has given us all that we have. What can we give him in gratitude? The fruit of our work and the conduct of our lives, the primitive offerings of our forefathers when they sacrificed the choicest of the beasts they had reared in the homestead, were typical of the eternal attitude of all mankind to the Creator. Our sacrifices, like the sacrifices of old, he that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. In my opinion, a plan of this kind would be of inconceivable utility to our blank. Its benefits would be very speedily felt. It would give new life and energy to the operations of government. Business would be conducted with dispatch, method, and system. A million of abuses now existing would be corrected, and judicious plans would be formed and executed for the public good. Hence all ethical teaching in lecture rooms, pulpits, and popular books, when it is decked out with blank of metaphysics, becomes ridiculous. But it is not therefore useless, much less ridiculous, to trace in metaphysics the first principles of ethics, for it is only as a philosopher that anyone can reach the first principles of this conception of duty. Otherwise we could not look for either certainty or purity in the ethical teaching. To rely for this reason on a certain feeling, which, on account of the effect expected from it, is called moral, may perhaps one who is acquainted with practical philosophy is not therefore a practical philosopher. The latter is he who makes the rational end the principle of his actions, while at the same time he joins with this the necessary knowledge, which, as it aims at action, must not be spun out into the most subtle threads of metaphysic, unless a legal duty is in question, in which case meum and tuum must be accurately determined in the balance of justice, on the principle of equality of action and action, which requires something like mathematical proportion, but not in the case of a mere ethical duty. For in this case the question is not only to know what it is a duty to do, a thing which on account of the ends that all men naturally have can be easily decided, But the chief point is the inner principle of the will, namely that the consciousness of this duty be also the spring of action, in order that we may be able to say of the man who joins to his knowledge this principle of wisdom that he is a practical philosopher. May perhaps even satisfy the popular teacher, provided he desires as the criterion of a moral duty to consider the problem, if everyone in every case made your maxim the universal law, how could this law be consistent with itself? But if it were merely feeling that made it our duty to take this principle as a criterion, then this would not be dictated by reason, but only adopted instinctively and therefore blindly. But in fact, whatever men imagine, no moral principle is based on any feeling, but such a principle is really nothing else than an obscurely conceived metaphysic which inheres in every man's reasoning faculty. As the teacher will easily find who tries to catechize his pupils in the Socratic method about the imperative of duty and its application to the moral judgment of his actions. The mode of stating it need not be always metaphysical, and the language need not necessarily be scholastic, unless the pupil is to be trained to be a philosopher. But the thought must go back to the elements of metaphysics, without which we cannot expect any certainty or purity, or even motive power in ethics. If we deviate from this principle and begin from pathological or purely sensitive or even moral feeling, for what is subjectively practical instead of what is objective, that is, from the matter of the will, the end, not from its form, that is the law, in order from thence to determine duties, then certainly there are no metaphysical elements of ethics, for feeling, by whatever it may be excited, is always physical. But then ethical teaching, whether in schools or lecture rooms, etc., is corrupted in its source. For it is not a matter of indifference by what motives or means one is led to a good purpose, the obedience to duty. However disgusting, then, metaphysics may appear to those pretended philosophers who dogmatize oracularly, or even brilliantly, about the doctrine of duty, it is nevertheless an indispensable duty for those who oppose it to go back to the principles even in ethics, and to begin by going to school on its benches. We may fairly wonder how, after all previous explanations of the principles of duty, so far as it is derived from pure reason, it was still possible to reduce it again to a doctrine of happiness, in such a way, however, that a certain moral happiness, not resting on empirical causes, was ultimately arrived at, a self-contradictory non-entity. In fact, when the thinking man has conquered the temptations to vice and is conscious of having done his often hard duty, he finds himself in a state of peace and satisfaction, which may well be called happiness, in which virtue is her own reward. Now, says the Eudaimonist, this delight, this happiness, is the real motive of his acting virtuously. The notion of duty, says he, does not immediately determine his will. It is only by means of the happiness in prospect that he is moved to his duty. Now, on the other hand, since he can promise himself this reward of virtue only from the consciousness of having done his duty, it is clear that the latter must have preceded. That is, he must feel himself bound to do his duty before he thinks, and without thinking, that happiness will be the consequence of obedience to duty. He is thus involved in a circle in his assignment of cause and effect. He can only hope to be happy if he is conscious of his obedience to duty, and he can only be moved to obedience to duty if he foresees that he will thereby become happy. But in this reasoning there is also a contradiction. For on the one side he must obey his duty without asking what effect this will have on his happiness, consequently from a moral principle. On the other side, he can only recognize something as his duty when he can reckon on happiness which will accrue to him thereby, and consequently on a pathological principle, which is the direct opposite of the former. I have in another place reduced, as I believe, to the simplest expressions the distinction between pathological and moral pleasure. The pleasure, namely, which must precede the obedience to the law in order that one may act according to the law, is pathological, and the process allows the physical order of nature, follows the physical order of nature. That which must be preceded by the law in order that it may be felt is in the moral order. We took the city by storm in the 4th hour of Saturday, the 4th day of the holy month of Ramadan, bringing blank to all those whom had chosen to garrison and defend it. Not one of them but had certain wealth, and now there is not one of us but owns one of them and his money. You would have seen your knights prostrate before your horses' hooves, the houses stormed by pillagers and ransacked by looters, your wealth weighed by the quintal, your women sold 4 at a time and bought for a dinar of your own money. You would have seen the crosses in your churches smashed, the pages of the false testaments scattered, the patriarchs' tombs overturned. You would have seen your Muslim enemy trampling on the place where you celebrate the Mass, cutting the throats of monks, priests, and deacons upon the altars, bringing sudden death to the patriarchs and slavery to the royal provinces. You would have seen fire running through your palaces, your dead burned in this world before going down to the fires of the next, your palace lying unrecognizable, the church of St. Paul and that of the Hussein pulled down and destroyed, and then you would have said, "Would that I were dust, and that no letter had ever brought me such tidings." Your soul would have left your body for sadness, you would have quenched its fires with the water of your tears. If you had seen your dwellings stripped of your wealth, your chariots seized at Suwaidia with your ships, your galleys become, as your enemies' property, detesters of you, you would then be convinced that the God who gave you Antioch has taken it away again. The Lord who bestowed that fortress on you has snatched it away, uprooting it from the face of the earth. You know now that we, by God's grace, have taken back from you the fortress of Islam that you seized, Derkush and Shakif Kafar Dubin, as well as all your possessions in the province of Antioch, that we have brought your troops down from the citadels and have seized them by the hair and scattered them far and wide, that there is no one who could be called a rebel this side of the river, that if it could, it would not call itself by that name any longer, and weeps for repentance. Its tears at first ran clear, but now the blood spilt into it has dyed them red. My chief care would be to put everything I had on the road there, even if it were only one projects are one thing, but it's the event that calls the tune. Her power had made itself felt far beyond the Peloponnese, even on the blank shores of the Zligian. She had overthrown the city which might have become an effectual bulwark against the terrible king of Macedon. All of them I ever met blank pugnacious. Alice guessed in a moment that it was looking for the fan and the pair of white kid gloves that she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them. But they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed since her swim in the pool, and the great hall with the glass table and the little door had disappeared completely. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice and called to her in an angry tone. "Why, Marianne, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick now." "He took me for his housemaid," said Alice as she ran off. "How surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking and hurried upstairs, in a great fear lest she should meet the real Marianne and be turned out of the house before she had found the fan and gloves. By this time Alice had found her way into a tidy little room with a table in the window, and on it a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and a pair of the gloves and was just going to leave the room when her eyes fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking-glass. She uncorked it and put it to her lips, saying to herself, "I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for really I'm quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." Before she had drunk half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, remarking, "That's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more." Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing, and very soon she had to kneel down on the floor. Still she went on growing, and as a last resource she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney, and said to herself, "Now I can do no more, whatever happens. What will become of me?" Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. After a few moments she heard a voice outside and stopped to listen. "Marianne! Marianne!" said the voice. "Fetch me my gloves this moment." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Alice knew it was the rabbit coming to look for her, and she trembled till she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now about 1,000 times as large as the rabbit, and had no reason to be afraid of it. Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but as the door opened inwards and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard it say to itself, "Then I'll go round and get in at the window." "That you won't," thought Alice, and after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded that it was just possible it had fallen into a cucumber frame or something of that sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's. "Pat! Pat! Where are you?" And a voice she had never heard before. "Sure then, I'm here, digging for apples, Your Honor." "Here, come and help me out of this." "Now tell me, Pat, what's that in the window? Sure it's an arm, Your Honor." "Sure it's an arm? Well, it's got no business there at any rate. Go and take it away."